Carl Jung identified a hidden power in those who walk alone. Where society sees someone antisocial or broken, he saw psychological strength. Loners who keep no friends were not weak, they were dangerous to the social order. Jung warned other psychologists to approach them carefully because what they represented threatened how human relationships are organized. The real illness, he observed, was not solitude but forced socialization. Most people fear being alone so deeply that they accept toxic bonds rather than face themselves. Jung's clinical work revealed that loners did not suffer from social deficits. They had developed immunity to the force that controls most human behavior, the need for validation. While others unconsciously obey group expectations, the loner stands outside them, unmoved by approval or rejection. Jung called this psychological independence. Through the collective unconscious, Jung showed how most people think they choose freely, while their decisions quietly mirror the group, how they dress, love, speak, and live. The loner never fully entered this system. Their nervous system learned stability through solitude, not applause. Where others need inclusion to feel real, the loner remains intact alone. Jung realized he was not studying pathology, but escape. The loner observes the social theater without wearing a mask, watching the machinery with clarity, not broken, not rebellious, simply free, and freedom, Jung knew, is what societies fear most. They see the lies people tell themselves, the gap between words and deeds, the patterns that recur across groups, relationships, institutions. While others perform, the loner watches, found their social intelligence can outstrip whole lifetimes, learned as observer, not participant. They spot the preacher who cheats, the supportive friend who undermines, the smiling colleague who sabotages, not from cynicism, but from clear pattern recognition, unburdened by the need for harmony. Once you see the game, you cannot unsee it. Naming it breaks the unspoken contracts that hold groups together, the family that ignores a father's drinking, the workplace that refuses to name a toxic boss, the circle that tolerates the perpetual victim. The loner becomes the problem because they refuse the agreed denial. Don't confuse loners with the lonely. Loneliness is lack, craving connection, and accepting harm to avoid being alone. Solitude is a chosen strength. The nervous system stops mirroring others and finally hears its own signals. The lonely are emptied by isolation, the solitary are filled, calm, and free. Drew this line again and again. When a loner is forced into social situations, they do not feel connection, they feel interference, like static across a clear signal. This is not pathology, but a different nervous system configuration that reads social input as noise rather than nourishment. Small talk becomes meaningless sound, rituals that comfort others register as wasted energy, feigned interest exhausts rather than engages. Observed that loners leave gatherings drained, not because they are merely introverted, but because they are processing the gap between speech and meaning, tracking performances while noting the authentic emotions leaking through. That dual attention is tiring. Solitude is not luxury but recovery. Also found that loners are often the only ones brave enough to meet their own darkness, the shadow the group projects outward to avoid. Groups offer endless chances to displace blame. You name another's cruelty and avoid your own. You mock dishonesty to hide your own. You join the chorus so you never look inward. The loner has no such luxury. Extended solitude forces an encounter with cruelty, selfishness, fear, and weakness that groups forbid acknowledging. Those who integrate their shadow become stronger than those who hide in crowds, for having faced their worst, they no longer shrink from exposure. Shame loses its power, accusations no longer unmake them. Conscious of both light and dark, they can choose differently. This integration is what called psychological sovereignty. A person who has met their darkness cannot be manipulated by threats of exposure because they already know what they are capable of. They've already accepted it, unblackmailable, unshameable, uncontrollable by the social levers that keep most people obedient. Documented this in his own confrontation with the unconscious years of solitude, facing visions and emotions that might have been called psychosis, parts of himself that contradicted everything he wanted to believe. He did not flee, he studied, integrated, and emerged changed, no longer afraid of his mind, no longer dependent on validation, psychologically more whole than most ever become. Work on shadow, archetypes, and individuation sprang from that lonely labor. The loner follows the same arc: solitude forces shadow integration, integration creates sovereignty, sovereignty threatens systems that govern by shame and social pressure. The loner who has integrated their shadow can walk away from toxic systems without fear, expose truths without fearing consequence, act on values that contradict collective expectation, called the moment the snap, not a breakdown, but absolute clarity, the refusal to seek the group's approval. Whistleblowers, truth tellers, those who abandon prestige for integrity, the group punishes them because they break the compact that sustains cohesion. But punishment relying on social pain fails when exclusion does not wound, shame has no hold, and reputation was never the source of identity. This is why the loner is dangerous, not evil, but free. A person who cannot be shamed, blackmailed, or coerced can refuse the very roles that prop up power. Studied this for decades and reached a conclusion that unsettles psychologists: the loner is not broken. The loner is evolved. They represent what human consciousness can become when it grows outside the collective program, not missing something others have, but accessing what most never find. Most people run cultural code without checking whether it serves them: beliefs about success, rules about relationships, which emotions are allowed, scripts for how life should go. These patterns feel personal, but are collective repeats. The loner refused the download and wrote their own operating system, dangerously incompatible with social infrastructure, but capable of innovations groupthink cannot imagine. Unconstrained by agreed limits, they see solutions others cannot. Uninvested in the status quo, they champion changes others fear. Found history's breakthroughs often came from such isolation: artists, scientists, philosophers, inventors who worked alone until the world caught up. The loner's legacy is liberation, not loneliness: proof you can survive outside the group, face your shadow, and integrate it. Lived this, his split with Freud left him isolated and ridiculed. Yet that solitude produced seminal insights that still shape thought. The loner who keeps no friends protects consciousness from interference to reach truth's collective participation obscures. They are not failing at relationships, they are succeeding at something rarer: the individuated self that thinks its own thoughts, feels its own feelings, and lives by its own values. The world needs loners not because they are superior, but because they see what others cannot and test whether systems still serve their purpose or merely perpetuate themselves. Message to those who keep no friends is simple: you are not broken, defective, or missing something you're accessing, what most never find. Your solitude is not a problem to fix, but a strength to guard. Your refusal to conform is immunity to the most powerful control system humans invented, the need for validation. Your discomfort in social settings is not merely anxiety, but a nervous system signal that performing a false self is worse than being alone with your authentic one. The dangerous truth discovered is this: the loner embodies human potential freed from collective limits, and that sovereignty terrifies control systems, not because loners wish to destroy society, but because their existence proves the mechanisms of control are optional. Freedom spreads. Each person who claims psychological sovereignty through solitude and shadow integration gives permission for others to try. That is why groups punish loners so severely. Their being undermines the compact that keeps everyone else compliant.